Hi guys, and welcome to this class. I'm so excited to show you how we're going to use this limited palette of 5 colors plus a little bit of white gouache to paint this playful and slightly whimsical hot air balloon. First off, let's go through our supplies. Here is our bookmark size dot card with 4 to 5 colors. We have cadmium yellow, permanent rose, cerulean blue, sepia, and a surprise color, which in this case is the hooker's green. We also have some white gouache for that last little bit of detail and sparkle at the end of the painting. Then we also have a piece of sponge which we'll use to wet our paper and to add some texture to the background. We have a round golden taklon head watercolor brush, a jar with clean water, and a normal HB pencil. You might also need a sharpener if your pencil goes blunt, and a piece of kitchen towel as we get started on the painting. Lastly, I'm also using the hot air balloon tracing paper template. If you don't have that on hand, you will also find the hot air balloon template in the downloads. You can print that directly onto a sheet of tracing paper. You can just print it normally as you would with any normal printing paper. Just make sure to set the layout that it prints to half the page. Or otherwise, you can just print it as a reference and draw this freehand. It's a fairly simple drawing, so you can just take it line by line and give it your own spin. That's the whole idea behind the template, is that you use it as a starting point and add your own details as you become more comfortable. Now let's talk through how you would go about using the tracing template. Step 1. Hold your pencil at a flat angle and scratch over the back of the template. Step 2. Place the template the right side up and secure it to your paper. You can do this using 2 pieces of masking tape at the top and the bottom of the tracing paper, or you can use 2 pieces of press stick. Now, make sure that your pencil is nice and sharp so that we can make sure that the lines are not too thick when we go over them just now. And you're going to take your pencil and just with very firm pressure go over the printed lines on the tracing paper. And the graphite that you've scratched onto the back will transfer these lines that you're making now onto the watercolor paper. And once you're done going over all the lines, you will have a lovely template to work from on your paper. Once you think you've covered all the lines, just loosen one end of your template and lift it up so that you can check the lines. And now when you're going to put it back down again, if you need to fix something, everything will still be in the right place. And there you have it. We're ready to start painting. Alright, and now for the really fun part. We're going to start painting. If you want to, you can use a piece of masonite or hardboard like this and some masking tape to tape down your watercolor paper. This is always useful to do even if you're using professional grade paper, as it does keep the paper from buckling too much and helps it to flatten straight. So for this demo, I'm going to show you the paper just as it is without any additional tools necessary. The first step here is I'm going to take my water spray bottle and just very lightly spray the paint on the paper. This will just help it to activate a little bit more easily when I use my sponge. But if you don't have a spray bottle on hand, you can just use your sponge and dab a little bit of clean water onto each dot. And just make sure to clean your sponge off in your water jar when you've done doing that. Now I'm taking my sponge and the clean water, I'm squeezing out the excess water into the jar and just using the moist sponge to wet the paper. And you'll see the paper gets a shine that you can notice when you pick up and tilt the paper. Where you've wetted it and where it's still dry, you won't see that glossy shine. And this is how we know where we've put the water. And the beautiful thing about watercolor is this is how you're going to control where the paint goes. As we add color to the background, you'll notice that the dry areas will keep the white of the paper and the wet areas will allow the paint to flow. I'm starting with a light blue. This is cerulean blue. It's a very, very light blue. You'll see it's actually a color that you can't get to a very dark value, but it's lovely for skies. Now you can use any color for your sky, but I went for a kind of traditional start here, but you'll see we're going to add some more colors very soon. So right now I'm not bothering to clean off my sponge too much. I'm just switching it around to use a different end so that I can use a clean part for the pink color. Otherwise I'm going to mix purple, which is great if that is what you want right now, but if you just want to add normal pink onto the paper, make sure to use a clean part of your sponge. Now here I'm purposefully mixing the pink into the yellow, and yes, it's going to dirty up the blob of paint for a little bit. I'll show you later how to clean that off. And I'm adding some yellowy orange and onto that horizon line. And it doesn't matter if it goes a little bit over our lines, that's no problem at all. We want to be playful and loose and have fun. I'm splattering some water onto the surface of the paper, and you'll see later once it's dried what beautiful texture that's created. Now that we have the base colors down for the sky, I want to add in a little bit more detail, and now I'm just playing. I'm going back to some of the colors. The only thing I'm taking care not to do is to put yellow directly into my blue sky. Green in the sky is perfectly fine. I've done green skies before into paintings, but again, if that's not exactly the effect that you're going for, rather keep the blue and the yellow apart and just split them with a little bit of pink, or mixing your blue and your pink for a purple. There was a little bit of sepia that sneaked in there, and it actually created quite a beautiful effect. Now I'm cleaning my sponge to make sure that it's completely clean, and I'm going to take a piece of paper towel and just twist it around on itself. And this is my eraser. I'm going to use this to erase some color from the sky to create some lighter parts for the clouds. And I love this kind of circular swooping motion. So you can follow that, or you can press it down and kind of scrunch it up a little bit to pick up little fluffy clouds. Have fun and experiment. This is how you get to know your paints, how you get to know your paper, and how you get to know the different techniques that's available to you in watercolor. You'll see me now specifically picking up some of that sepia. We're going to come into the foreground, into the mountain areas, and I'm putting down the darkest color into the front area of my landscape. This is because the area that's closest to us will be to the darkest part that we see, and because of the atmospheric effect, it will become a little bit more pale and more blue and lighter towards the distance. So I'm turning my paper around so that the paint can flow from the top, which is now the top, which was the bottom just now, into the distance, and this is helping me create that effect of dark to light from the foreground to the background. For the sky, if you wanted to do that for a normal sky, it goes from the top to the bottom, and the area at the horizon is always the lightest. So here we're cleaning off our dot card. You can just take your brush with a little bit of clean water and just swirl it around on the side of the brush on that dot and rinse it off until you feel that the dot is clean enough again. Now I'm using the bookmark itself as the mixing area. So I'm picking up some water, moving up some paint, and then putting that down onto the paper, and this is enough for the small painting that I can pick it up from there right as if I'm using a palette. If you are not comfortable doing this, you can always have a small side plate on hand, or any piece of plastic bowl or plastic plate to mix your paint in. Now you can see that if you didn't have the surprise color of green on your palette, you can mix that using your blue and your yellow. I'm also mixing in a little bit of my hooker's green here just for some variation, and just working this into the landscape area while the paint is still wet. So that creates a very nice gradual transition in the foreground towards the background. And then I'm adding some texture by splattering it over the page. Now something here, obviously if you're splattering some green paint for the foreground and for the landscape, you don't want that to go all over your beautiful sunset sky. So use a piece of kitchen towel or other clean cartridge paper and just cover up the areas that you don't want the splatter on. And if it's not coming off of your brush easily enough, just pick up a little bit more paint, add a little bit more water until you can tap the brush and see the drops of paint coming off. Once we've done that, we're going to add a little bit more texture using the back of our brush. Did you know that you can use this to create some streaks and lines and stalks of leaves into the foreground? So I'm scratching into the foreground with the back of my brush. I'm following some of the contour lines. I'm creating little grasses or flower stalks, as you'll see these change a little bit later. And this scratches white areas into the paper that's going to add some beautiful variation and texture later on. And I'm just continuing to work some detail into this landscape while the paint is still wet. So you'll notice when we come back to this area, everything is going to blend into each other a little bit. These pink dots that I've added are fairly watery, and they are going to create these beautiful blooms of water texture on the paper as it dries. So you can see is also where a spot of water dripped, and I want this pink pigment to push away the other colors so that I can come and add these flowers in later on when the paper has dried. So this is our very first layer, and it can feel rather messy at this point, but I want you to embrace all the textures and all the unexpected things that are happening. This is the beauty of watercolor. It does a little bit of its own thing and a little bit of the unexpected, but if you come to embrace that and come to understand the basic techniques and just allow yourself to play, you'll come to find that this is your very, very favorite part. And welcome back. I hope that you are pleasantly surprised by what's happened on your paper. You will notice that it doesn't look quite the way you left it, whether you've just dried it with your hairdryer or whether you've come back after a good night's sleep. There will be some surprises on the paper. And I want you to embrace these textures and little details. So now that we're going to come back, the beautiful thing about watercolor is we can layer another layer of paint over this dried first layer. Now you are using student grade paint. This is the Canson XL watercolor paper, and I found that 2, maybe 3 layers, if I work carefully, is the most that I can do on this paper. So you'll also see that because the paper is completely dried at the bottom, when we put on a new layer of paint, it won't really move the colors that's already there. So we can come in and layer over that, and we can also create some sharper edges as we now want to come and define some more detail in the painting. Also take a moment to think about your colors on the hot air balloon. I'm going to use yellow for the one set of alternating stripes, some green for the middle stripes, and then I'm going to come in with some purple for that ribbon at the bottom, and just some straight sepia for the basket. So the first thing we do is to pick up some clean water with our brush. If your water is very, very muddy from the previous painting session, just make sure to put in some clean water in your jar. And as I lift up my brush from the jar, I'm just tapping off most of the excess water and then coming into my paint dot and rolling my brush a little bit around on that paint. I'm picking up a slightly thicker concentration of paint, and you'll see that as I put that onto the paper. It's still wet though, so as I come and color in these different segments, you'll see that it has a fairly smooth transition. Don't worry if you're not quite comfortable with this yet. You can practice a little bit on printer paper if you're struggling to control your brush for the smaller movements. In between, I take a moment to splatter some of this color into different areas of the painting. I just love some splatter, and I find that this brings the painting together by repeating some of these colors into other areas of the painting. So I'm just coming in to finish those lines. I'm keeping a light touch on my brush and using the tip of this brush to kind of find those edges of the hot air balloon and the stripes. But you will notice that you can use this brush for really fine lines if you keep it almost upright with the tip to the paper, and some bigger motions if you use the belly or the bigger part of the brush. For this next part, you'll see that I'm going to move to areas that don't quite touch directly. I'm trying to work as much as possible into different areas of the painting without going back to my hairdryer just yet. So as long as there's a piece of white paper separating the different parts that I'm working on, I can move between those parts and between those colors, and then I'll come back later to the other stripes in the big hot air balloon to come and add my green segment. So for now, I'm following the same process to pick up a nice amount of brown paint, and I'm just using the side of my brush to fill in the biggest part of that basket, and using the tip to come and clean out the lines. So here's what I said is, if you keep your brush quite upright, you'll see that there's the sharp tip of the brush, and that helps us to define those details. And while the watercolor is still slightly wet on the paper, those edges will just smooth out and blend nicely to create the finer details. So I'm just coming in with the tip of my brush and doing those small little baskets. Remember that these can be as big or as small as you want them to be. No one is going to see the template, they're just going to see your final painting and be very impressed by it, I can promise you that. So I'm making sure to rinse off my brush thoroughly by swishing it in my water and then dabbing it on my paper towel to make sure that it is clean. So as I look at this foreground, I know that I want to bring in a little bit more green. It's just because I love green, and obviously that's always a good color for a landscape. And then I pick up some more clean water, and here again you can choose if you have a green as a surprise color on your dot card. You can use that with a bit of yellow to brighten it up for the foreground, or just use your yellow and blue as a mixture. Now I'm coming in, I noticed that my lines on my hot air balloons were dry enough. You can do that with touching it with the back of your hand. And you can see there that those edges are staying crisp. And if they're blending in here a little bit, don't worry. Maybe just move to another area of the painting until these lines are completely dried. Or just step away for a short moment to take a quick painting break. But if it's dried, you can come in with your green. I'm just continuing to mix it right on my dot card and filling in those spaces. If you see white streaks of paper showing through your color, this means that you haven't quite picked up enough paint with your brush. So you can also then just go back to your dot card and just pick up more paint and fill in those areas. And again, here, if the textures turn out a little bit differently, if it's not quite smooth, that's part of the charm of watercolor. I can promise you, I've come back to paintings where I thought things were a mistake, and then a day or a week or months later, those are some of my favorite parts and characteristics of that painting. So just embrace it and enjoy the color flowing onto the page. I'm coming in for some pink, and I'm mixing that in with the sepia to darken it a little bit. That's why I've got the sepia in this limited color palette. It's a great color to add those darks, and you can just mix it in with whatever color you want to darken up. And I'm coming in, and you might not think brown is a good color to mix for flowers, but here it's creating a beautiful contrast, this dark, almost maroon pinky mixture onto those light pink watercolor blooms that we created earlier. So I'm just using the tip of my brush and picking up more color to darken it even more, dropping in bits of color with little dabby motions, and just letting my brush play and dance across the paper into a kind of rough flower shape. These reminded me a little bit of lavenders, but it really could be anything. And remember, this is your painting and your imagination, so just have fun. You could also have made these flowers a little bit more purple by adding some blue and pink together. And now I'm just coming in with the stalks of the flowers with the back of my brush that will pick up some of that wet paint that I've added back in and just kind of blend everything back together. And I'm just adding a little bit of the pink at the bottom of these flowers and blending it out with some water on my brush to anchor that into the landscape. So we're coming in with some more yellow and green, and we're going to come and touch up the front areas of the stalks and a little bit more into the background of the landscape. So again, here I want to focus on starting to use more pigment than water. You'll start to feel the paint feeling a little bit more sticky under your brush, a little bit more difficult to move on the paper. And this is what we want. With watercolor, we build up the colors from light to dark, versus other opaque mediums where we go from dark and add the lighter details later. Now, as I mentioned before, you can see here I'm touching the paper to check whether these back balloons are dried completely. Especially there, I don't want the paint to blur too much at all because there's not a lot of space for that to happen. So I'm just touching it very gently with the back of my finger. If the paper is still cool, if any color comes off, it's still wet, then I just need to give it a little bit more time. And so I'm coming in with the purple on my main balloon first and adding a little bit more of that purple detail into the foreground as well. And experiment a little bit here with where you hold the brush. You'll notice if you hold it more towards the tip, it'll be a tighter, more controlled grip. If you hold it more towards the back of the brush, that'll give you a looser, more sweeping motion. So it depends on whether you want to do finer or bigger motions in that moment. Now here I'm happy that my background balloon is dried enough, or I thought so. And then I noticed the paint running just a little bit, so I came in with the pink into the foreground ribbon as well, and then going into the second balloon in the back, just taking careful care to fill in those little details, but not stressing too much if it doesn't quite go to plan. I'll just come and work with it with a pen when we come back. Again, I'm rinsing my brush thoroughly, and I just want to show you here that the paint has moved a little bit into the yellow. I didn't quite get those lines the way that I wanted to, and that's perfectly fine. This all just adds some extra playful character. I can, however, go in with a little bit of paper towel and fix that by taking a small part and just rubbing along the edge of the heart air balloon to pick up that excess paint that's gone over the lines. So if at any point you want to fix something, have your paper towel on hand. It'll be your eraser. Especially while your paint is still wet, you can come and pick up some of it and kind of fix anything that didn't go according to plan, but really just keep that for the most extreme cases. Now at this point, should you prefer to keep it at a looser painting, or if time has gone really tight and you just have to leave things here, this is a perfectly great place to leave your painting. I do, however, want to show you one last trick that will help us add just those fine details that while you're still getting used to the brush and the finer points of using the brush, having some pen detail is a great way of just finishing up those final touches. But for now, we're just going to use the white gouache that's on the dot card so that we can keep things really limited. Even if you don't want to use pen, you can come back in with some pencil, even some normal HB pencil or a bit of colored pencil. I'm just using a very, very cheap ballpoint pen, one of those that you get in packs of 100 at a time. And I'm just adding in the details for the little ropes for the baskets, holding it to the hot air balloon, here and there defining the outline of the balloon. And you really don't have to worry about making thick, solid strokes all the way around. It can be a broken line. This adds quite a nice character to the painting as well. So you see it also on the big balloon and along the ribbons. I'm just highlighting some parts of it to kind of bring little details into focus. For the flowers, I'm making little doodly, squiggly motions and just again bringing in a bit of shape. I'm specifically adding that flower shape to parts of the painting that doesn't have the pink color, as I love how that little bit of separate pen line together with the color, how that looks. So you can experiment and play around, and I'm just adding some of the flower stalks as well, and then coming in and defining a little bit of the landscape lines, some detail in the background, some imaginary bushes, whatever you feel like playing with. And again, if you feel like uncomfortable at any time, have a little bit of cartridge paper on hand and just doodle on that first to warm up your wrist and warm up your mind, and to just let go, and then you'll be more comfortable when you come into the painting. The last little bit of pen detail was for the lines on this hot air balloon. I just felt that the inside lines just needed a little bit of detail as well. Doesn't it look beautiful already? Take a moment to enjoy what you've created so far. We're just going to come back with one last tip that I want to share with you, and that's adding a little bit of white over the last phase of your watercolor. You can skip this step if you like, but especially if there's some parts that you feel it went too dark, you can come in with some white gouache and just brighten it up a bit. I love to pick up some more diluted gouache, a little bit more water to paint, and splatter that over. I'm using the piece of paper towel to cover up areas again. And then I come in and I try and pick up the gouache as thickly as I can, so that I can get a nice bright white line or some white dots, just for some highlights and texture along your painting. I like to do this around the curve of the baskets, around the curve of the hot air balloon. Really, any random place will add a little bit of extra character to your painting. And I also like to just dab with the tip of my brush to create little dots and little bits of sparkle with splatter and those last fine details onto the painting. I also come in and add a little bit of that detail into the background of the landscape, along the edges of the back balloons, and then I tell myself to stop. I can easily overwork this phase and I don't want to, so rather stop sooner than later, but you can add a little bit of detail. And I'm just coming back in with my black ballpoint pen to add literally some dots onto different parts of the paper, 2 or 3 at a time. I just like the effect this creates, so it kind of links up with the splatter that I've created, with the dots I've created with the white gouache, and there you have it. Often the painting is done sooner than you think and requires less work than you think. Now remember, at the beginning I said that we can paint this without taping it down, but you will see that the paper has buckled and it's quite warpy. Even if you press this down into a frame, you'll see that it moves around quite a bit. So all I do to fix that is I take my spray bottle, or you can take a clean sponge or a clean brush with clean water, and just lightly wet the back of your paper. And make sure that you have an area or a book or a sketchbook with a clean piece of paper that you can put this down onto. You especially want to make sure that the front of your painting is on a clean area. Put a stack of books over on it and let it dry for a couple of hours or overnight, and you'll be set. It'll be nicely flattened out. And there you have it. Just remember to clean your supplies, rinse out your sponge, rinse off your brush. Make sure to put your brush down flat after having cleaned it, and just slightly reshape the tip with your fingers. If you let it dry upright, the water will run into the back of the brush and it will start cracking the wood. So just let it dry flat before you put it upright away into a jar. And there you go. There is your finished painting. I truly hope you enjoyed this class, and I would love to see what you created.